a work in progress, and we're very much hoping that your feedback will inform the framework. To start with, it'd be really helpful for me and Nick to be, Nick Edwards is my co-presenter. I think most of you might be able to see her. It says educational psychology under Nick's picture. So that's Nick Edwards. It won't say her name, it just says educational psychology. So what we'd really like to do to start off with is, if you don't mind putting in the chat, just one word or a couple of words to say what identity means to you at this moment in time. What's your interpretation of identity? What do you think of? It'd be really helpful to know that from your professional points of view, where identity fits in with your work and what you think of identity. Do you mind just taking a couple of minutes to do that? Yeah.
Can you see that, Jo?
I can, yeah. So it's popping up. So who you are as a person, who you are, yeah. Where you belong, yeah. How I see myself and how others see me. Sense of self, yeah, yeah. How you fit in. Sense of self, your relation to others, knowing who you are, yeah. Yeah. Where you've come from and where you belong, yeah. People's individual experiences and perspectives. Ah, yeah. So someone's put that kind of different roles that make up identity and how people know you, yeah. Thank you for that. It's a really helpful starting point in knowing where you're coming at identity from. And that kind of resonates with us in terms of what we think of identity. I'm going to just read you a definition, and this definition is just taken from yourdictionary.com, and this is kind of like a starting point for us. So the definition is who you are. So identity is who you are, the way you think of yourself, the way you are viewed by the world, the characteristics that define you. So that's kind of like a standard dictionary definition of identity. We as psychologists started thinking of identity more as what we call a congruent sense of who we are. So a sense of who we are that we agree with, that we feel harmonious about. That's our identity, and it's very important for our positive mental health and well-being. One of the things that we have realised as we've done a lot more reflection on identity and thinking about identity is how much of a term, it's quite a difficult term to hold on to. It's a bit like sand through your hands, identity. It seems so fluid, and so it's forever kind of moving. And whereas in the past, maybe some theories have seen identity as quite static and a thing, that's not the way we within our teams have been thinking about identity. We've been thinking very much about identity as very fluid, moving throughout our lifetime. Moving through experiences, changing developmentally, but also changing because of the experiences that we have and the social foundations that we have. It's been something that we've kind of come to think of within the thinking we've been doing. We see it as a very much a foundation of most of the work that we do, and we've begun to wonder just how much difference it could make. We were thinking within education in particular, how much difference it could make if the professionals we work with within schools and other services had the idea of the developing self at the centre of the work they do with young people. And if we're constantly as adults thinking to ourselves, what am I adding to this person's sense of who they see themselves as? What am I adding to this person's sense of identity? And that in itself can really shape then the problem solving and the approach that we take to those young people. Okay. Let me just check if I've missed
that came out loads ago, actually. I was just thinking in the keynote speech, in that Richard was talking about a lot of the people who'd been significant to him in his life. And because I'm saying this everyone else because Jo wasn't able to come to the keynote speech, but it fits in quite well because those the impact of some of those people on his sense of identity, as well as the events that happened to him on his sense of identity, was really one of the things that stuck out, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thank you. I just want to read one more thing out to you, because it kind of just extends a little bit what I was saying about identity being quite a difficult construct to grasp, and how it kind of feels like it's going through your hands sometimes. It has been studied by lots of different disciplines, so psychology being one of them, sociology being another, philosophy, anthropology. So it's an identity is a concept that's been studied in lots of different ways. And I'm just going to read something out to you that we've put in our framework, just to kind of sum up the abstractness of identity, I guess. So it is both singular and plural, real and imagined, individual and collective, defined by sameness and difference. Its ambiguity is maybe because it is maybe due, to the fact it's formed and reformed and created and shaped by discourse. So it's shaped by the language around us, it's shaped by the narratives around us, and through relationships. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the framework. Hall in 1991, who was a sociologist, kind of summed it up. Identity is fluid, not static. It happens over time, and it's never stable. It is subject to the play of history and of difference. Okay. Nick, do you think I've covered that okay?
Yes, that's great, yeah.
Could we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so this brings us on to the pillars. So the draft framework that we've put together, we've based on this idea of 5 pillars on the foundation. This foundation, a stone foundation on the image, is social environment. So we're very much thinking that identity is constructed from our social experiences, from our social environment around us. So the foundation, sorry, can you see my hands? The foundation is the social environment, and then the pillars, the 5 pillars, are coming up from that. Now, the 5 pillars that we've come to, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on this towards the end of the session. The 5 pillars as we see it are the things that really are central to identity, are relationships, belonging, developmental, values, and language, and they're all based on the social environment. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a history of the journey of how we've got to where we are with this draft framework. So a few years ago, there was a small group of myself and a few colleagues were thinking about identity from the point of view of children. It was through casework, so children and young people we were working with through casework who had particular descriptions or diagnoses, and it felt like what we were being asked to do was to support staff in working through with those young people their reactions, responses, understanding of these descriptions and diagnoses that they had. And that seemed to be the stuckness in those situations, that the young person needed time to process the way they were being described. And so there were a few of us interested in that, and we did a little bit of what we call a summer interest group in our service. We did a summer interest group around this. And it so happened that kind of around about the same time, the Tackling Emerging Threats to Children's team, they asked us as a psychology service for a definition of identity. And it kind of threw us a little bit, because we didn't really have a clear service position, if you like, on identity and what we defined as identity. And that's a few years ago, so it has taken us some time. But the group of EPs who were working with the Tackling Emerging Threats to Children team, we started giving it more thought, and so it kind of came together. So we kind of were coming at it from 2 different angles. We were thinking about what the tech team were asking us in terms of their thinking was initially around transgender, but I think it's the work we've been doing with them has kind of moved us on in our thinking in terms of the anti-racism work we've been doing recently. And then it was also this kind of influence thinking about children and how they respond to descriptions and diagnoses. So that's kind of where our thinking began and our reflections began around identity. We also have something in our service called CCC groups, which is kind of CPD development work. And a little bit of that time has also been given to thinking about identity. So we're very lucky in our service to have that time to do this reflection and this thinking, and we realised how important it was, because it kind of underpins a lot of the other work that we'll be doing, and it's kind of grown in that way. Sorry, I'm quite enthusiastic about it, so I won't go on about it, but that's where it's grown from. And it's obviously relevant to lots of different groups of young people. Nick, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you've summarised it. We will come back to all these pillars. That's what we're going to spend the next part of the session, isn't it, talk about. So don't worry if you didn't catch them all. We're going to go through them all one by one. Yes,
yeah. I think the very fact it's taken us as a service, as psychologists, so much time to think about this and reflect on this, it demonstrates the complexity of what we're talking about when we talk about identity. I think that's really important to hold in mind. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, the first pillar is we're thinking about the social environment, which is not a pillar, sorry, it's the foundation. Shall I hand over to you, Nate?
Yeah. So I'll just give you a minute to read through the bullet points on the slide. So about comparing ourselves and defining ourselves, but in relation to social environment, social norms, power structures, sociopolitics, the way people respond to us. So that's the context that's underlying all of the pillars, that this is what affects our sense of identity all the time. So assumptions might be made by one group of people about another group, as we know. Often the assumptions that are propagated in society are those that are made and held by the majority group, sometimes at the expense of the minority groups in society, in whatever that can be seen as, those minority groups. I mean, for example, Richard spoke about his life this morning, and a lot of the times in his life, he was feeling like a minority group within the society he was in because of what was happening to him in his family and his life. And Tajfel, one of the psychologists writing about identity, he identified that stereotyping of groups, which are perceived as being others, so not like us, they're others, can lead to misunderstandings and very simplistic and harmful beliefs about other people and their identities, which can then obviously affect the development of their identity, being in that context where they're othered and where they're seen as not quite fitting in. And that we all have a tendency to do this as humans. We do it all the time. It's a way that we make sense of the world. We put people in boxes and we make assumptions. But we, as people that work with children and young people who are often very vulnerable, it's really important, obviously, that we are very aware of that doing this can lead to a lot of problems, a lot of negative assumptions and discrimination. So these cultural constructs that are the sort of right ways that we think of in society of doing things, or the majority ways, or the more valued ways, affect people's own sense of identity and affect other people's ideas about each other's identities all the time. So, for example, a social norm might be in our society to be raised by two birth parents. And how do we as people in the society react or respond if that doesn't happen, even in very tiny ways? You know, how do we respond with that assumption underlying maybe our idea of social norms? And how might the way we respond, and maybe not us, but wider society, you know, maybe we hope that we don't make these assumptions, but how might those responses that people get affect their own children's and young people's own sense of identity? So if someone has an identity as a professional or an individual that is a majority identity, that can often mean that they've got a stronger and more positive sense of belonging, well-being, resilience, privilege, because those people will have often received consistent messages over time that reinforce those messages that they belong, and they feel represented within the society that they're in. However, if someone's identity is a minority one in any way, or they perceive it's a minority one because of the responses they get from others, that could mean that they have probably experienced isolation, discrimination, marginalisation, and a lack of representation or negative messages about their identity. And that can be through personal relationships or relationships with us as professionals, or wider through society, through the media, through other ways of society can communicate those messages. So Rogers, a well-known psychologist in 1959, proposed that for a person to grow, they need an environment that provides them with the ability to feel safe. So genuineness, being able to feel a sense of openness and self-disclosure, and also a sense of acceptance, being able to be responded to with unconditional positive regard, which is something that as humans we find quite difficult to give to people who we judge as not quite fitting in. And empathy, being listened to and understood. So we are aware, as we talk about all these things, that a lot of this won't be new to you, and especially in the work that you do. It's just that we're trying to bring these ideas together under this umbrella of identity to sort of make sense of how all of these aspects affect identity. So that social environment is the basis of all of the pillars that we've used in Nottinghamshire at the moment to try and define identity.
Nick, Nick, before we move on to the next slide, do you think it would be, do you think we ought to just pause and see if anyone's got any questions or?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Comments or thoughts, anything they want to share either verbally or just in the chat.
Yeah, it's Teresa from Virtual School. It's just reflecting really on just how important it is. And I know in the Virtual School we've had reflections on how in the last year it's been easier to miss it working virtually. So, for example, we'd go into a school and you'd pick up on all these identity cues, the most basic and simple of which being the colour of the child that you're working with. And we've had more than one occasion where, unless we've sought it out through Mosaic, nobody's told us, and we've missed potentially something, or almost missed something potentially really significant in finding the right school for that child, because we've missed that they're dual heritage and that actually they need to, as one child puts it in her words, I want to go to a school where there's people that look like me. So I think the timing of this is so useful in the work that we're doing, and recognizing our own not flaws, but our own limitations in the current climate, and how we can overcome some of those.
That's a really good point. Yeah, thanks, Teresa.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa.
It makes it even more important to get that child and young person's voice, doesn't it, to actively seek it out when things aren't so obvious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll move on, but please do put anything in the chat that you'd like to share, either comments or questions. Whoever's not speaking out of us can always look at the chat and respond. So the first pillar that we're going to talk about is relationships. And again, I know we're going to mention here things that you know really well. So it's not we're trying to teach you about this, it's just we're trying to just put relationships into the context of identity. So obviously the first relationship, or often the first relationship that we have, is very significant. And we all know that attachment is the process by which newborn children develop a close bond with their carers. And in doing that, they learn how to regulate their own feelings, and they learn a lot about relationships and how to control their own behaviour, and just a secure attachment and that relationship provides that secure base that we all need when we're young to seek comfort from, and to be able to go out and explore the world and feel safe. And it's crucial really in children beginning to develop a positive sense of identity, their own identity and their identity in the context of those really significant relationships. So beyond that, those early few attachment relationships with early caregivers, the adults and peers around whom the children interact at school, nursery, all of those social situations are going to become key relationships for their ongoing development, and particularly as they develop their sense of identity. The humanistic psychologist Rogers proposed the idea of, which I've already mentioned, unconditional positive regard, which is a great thing to bear in mind, and especially with thinking about relationships and attachment. So this means approaching those that we're supporting in our work with acceptance at all times, in order to provide a safe space for them to develop and grow. It requires a focus on relationships and within these trusting relationships, so that children can learn, accept their individual strengths and areas for development and challenges, and help them to be able to explore difficult, strong emotions and understand experience that they have and be able to move forward. Is there anything else to add, Jo, to that one?
Nick, I was only going to say, as you were talking, that it's just to point out that although we've got these pillars, they do obviously interact. There's overlap between them. So, because I was just thinking about when I come onto the developmental pillar, it talks very much about attunement and that building of that attunement within relationships. But so it was just to comment on even though they're pillars. But I mean, I guess one of the things maybe the group might want to think about is, are pillars the best metaphor for this? Because we've talked about this before ourselves, haven't we? Because although they look like they stand alone, actually they are very much connected. And yeah, that's all I was going to say, really.
Yeah, we were worried that it made it seem a bit too concrete, didn't we, and set in stone, literally, and that it doesn't really show that flow between the different aspects. So the second pillar I'm going to talk about is belonging. So the notion of belonging, or feeling a positive sense of social identity, is a central aspect of how we define who we are. We consider ourselves to be individuals, but we also see ourselves in the context of being a member of different groups. And that's really important in us constructing a sense of identity. So many theorists, such as Maslow, talk about the importance of the concept of belonging, and a feeling of being connected to a particular social groups and fitting in. And similarly, really, school connectedness, or the attachment that children and young people have with the school or setting that they're in, is a really important predictor of school success. There are a few references that we may or may not read out, but we are going to, rather than keep spoiling the flow with mentioning various psychologist names, hopefully you'll get we know you're going to get a copy of this presentation sent to you at the end. And we've asked that it has the notes in so that you can see some of the references and the psychologists that we're referring to, but rather than keep reading them out, hopefully you'll be able to read it later. So the stable links, having stable links between school and home environments increases the probability of success for children and young people. And this is one of the really important reasons why children need to feel a strong sense of school connectedness. In general, families across all ethnic backgrounds, income levels and citizenship status, they all want their children to succeed in school. And the family involvement in schools is a really effective and low-cost strategy that schools can use to their advantage. But it can seem to be quite difficult sometimes for families and schools to capitalise on this. And to build relationships and to have those opportunities for involvement with each other can often seem to be more difficult than it might be anticipated. But it can be facilitated by recognising the cultural strengths and assets of diverse families. So for us as professionals, to be encouraging everyone we work with to value those cultural identities and try and draw them out, so that children from all different home backgrounds feel that their cultural references are valued and understood and known about, really. And that this whole thing is often called cultural capital. Sometimes majority groups, in whatever sense that's understood, can feel that they've got a lot of cultural capital, and others are left feeling that they haven't. And for us to make sure that we're aware of that and really draw out and make those connections so that everybody's cultural capital is valued equally is a really important thing that we can do. Thinking about power as well in this, so the cultural strengths and assets that different families hold are very powerful, and by valuing some and not others, we're really skewing that power dynamic. So it's really helpful if schools can actively provide opportunities for all groups to feel the membership, an equal membership in the school community, so that children and young people don't get that sense that their cultural background is less valued. And providing positive frames of reference throughout the curriculum. So that we've been talking in our as psychologists a lot recently about the Black curriculum as an example of an organisation that's been set up to promote that diversity in the curriculum, so that and in a similar way, you know, if we could do that for everybody, so that everybody's backgrounds and home environments are valued and cultural capital is valued to the same extent. Jo, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered that really well. Thank you, Nick.
So we're going to move on to the developmental pillar.
Thanks, Nick. Interestingly, when we started this, I thought the developmental pillar would probably be one of the most straightforward, because there's so much psychology around so much developmental psychology around, that I just assumed it would be straightforward. But it's actually been the pillar that we've had to rethink the most. We took the draft framework to our service, and the developmental pillar was the one that people kind of disagreed with the most, really. So what we've done is we've moved away from any prescriptive psychological theories that are developmental. I don't know if any of you will have heard of people like Erikson's theory of identity, for example. We've kind of shifted away from those kind of prescriptive theories, and we're thinking more broadly in terms of identity as ever changing and developing over a lifespan. And what we've considered within that is, one of the key things, which I'm going to come on to talk a little bit more about, because it is one of the pillars, is language. So we considered how a child's language and where they are developmentally with their language, how that would impact, for example, on their sense of identity, and to what extent would the adults around the young person need to scaffold I guess conversations and experiences to ensure that even if they don't have the language that their peers have, that they still have the opportunities to develop a comprehensive and cohesive sense of themselves. So we've thought a little bit about language development as part of identity development, if you see what I mean. And one of the other things we've thought about around development in terms of identity is attunement. So that links back to what Nick was talking about in terms of relationships. So thinking about the developmental need for that early attunement, and how that remains very important, if not essential, throughout a lifetime, to have those relationships and the attunement within them. I guess in order to, many of you said at the beginning when I asked you about what identity means to you, it's about who we are, but it's also about how other people see us. And those relationships are one way that we understand that we realise that. And I guess one of the other things we've considered around developmental is, I guess one thing we can't ignore is the maturation, the physical maturation of an individual, and also what that means for their neurodevelopment, for the brain development, the development of the connections, neural connections, and how that links to the social learning that we do, the social environment, and the impact of social environment on us. So we've kind of, we do need to think about the developmental aspect of identity a little bit more, I think in our own, to be clear in ourselves what we want this pillar to look like. We're kind of still thinking that through, but we have got some ideas.
Can I just ask Jo?
Yeah, please do.
Sorry, it's Teresa again.
Yeah.
There's an echo. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Yeah.
Is there an echo from my end?
No, it's from me. I can hear myself. It's fine. In terms of language development, we kind of, I think, automatically assume we're talking about preschoolers, primary children. But no, I'm really glad to see you shake your head, because I think that's one of the things I find a lot when I go into schools and there's been an incident, some kind of behaviour issue that the school is struggling to deal with, is, right up to teenagers post 16, they've never had the language to be able to explain the emotions and the reasons. And so it's still, I think, at every age about understanding that. And I think it's important that our schools understand that too.
Yeah. Teresa, you might be interested to know that one of our CCC groups at the moment is actually working on some guidance around communication, language communication in schools. So we'll keep you posted on that.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
But the other thing you've reminded me of as well, Teresa, is in terms of you linked it to behaviour. And one of the other things that we've been talking about as part of the developmental aspect of identity is what we call executive functioning skills. And one of those executive functioning skills is emotional regulation. And I think it would be interesting for us to think about the language development, the social environment, and how that interacts with the language development skills of the young person, and how all that interacts with their ability to regulate themselves emotionally. I think that feels like that could be where we go with this developmental pillar for identity. Nick, have I made sense of that? Because I was a bit nervous about this. I was a bit nervous about this one, if I'm honest, because we're still rethinking it ourselves, aren't we?
What Teresa's just said links in with a lot of the work we do on emotion coaching, doesn't it? And things like that, where we're trying to get that sort of language embedded early on in schools. Yeah. And it's really hard. I mean, I think it's hard as adults even to sometimes stop and think and label what you're actually feeling.
Yeah, it is. But in terms of the developmental pillar for identity, I guess what I'm saying is it's still evolving, but it will very much take into account the kind of how the maturation links in with the way that we respond to the social environment, and that will include thinking about attunement, language, and regulation and executive functioning in a broad way, I think.
Being able to notice how other people are responding to you as well is something that can be developmental, can't it? And that can affect you, as we've talked about, that can affect your sense of identity, how other people respond. And if you're not really aware of how other people are responding, that's going to affect your identity again in a different way, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you want to move on to the next one, Nick? Thanks. Are we okay for time, Nick? I'm just checking.
We're on 22, so
crack on. Okay, so values is one of the pillars, and we were inspired again by Rogers, who Nick's already mentioned. So Rogers was advocating the right for every individual to develop their own value system independently, so without influences exerted from people with power or pressure to socially conform. So Rogers very much felt that every individual should be given the time and space to develop their own value system without external influences. And I know that sounds very idealistic, but we've got to consider that comes from a position of therapy. So thinking Rogers was very much wanting to provide an environment where people could be facilitated within a therapeutic situation to think about their own value systems independently. And Rogers was taking what we call a humanistic approach in psychology, and a couple of the other paradigms in psychology we've been influenced by on our thinking around this has been PCP and personal construct psychology, and we were thinking about the core constructs that people have, and they are kind of like your values, and also narrative psychology, which very much holds our values at the centre of our sense of identity. So, so values is very much one of the pillars that we've considered. So we move on to language, and then the last pillar is language, and it kind of overlaps a little bit with developmental in terms of thinking about the we could look at this in terms of the language skills of the young person and how we might need to scaffold in order to give them the opportunities for reflection about who they are. There's that element of it, but the other element of the language pillar is thinking about actually how identity is formed through language. So when we consider the conversations we have with children, when we consider the conversations we have with each other as adults, the words that we use, the language we use very much shapes the sense of identity that we have, that they have. There's a whole area of psychology, discourse psychology, which very much talks about all experience being shaped by discourse, by the words that we use, and that's one area of psychology that has influenced our thinking around how important language is to identity. And I guess we were also linking it in with what I said right at the beginning of that journey that we were on, and thinking about the descriptions we have of children, whether they be a diagnosis or whether they just be a description, a word that we use, even something like naughty, for example, and just being very mindful of the words that we use and thinking about what is our use of language with a child, what are we adding to that child's sense of themselves. Just being mindful that the language we use can actually shape the way that that child thinks about themselves and the way they might carry that forward into the future. I don't know about most of you, but you know, it's one of those things where if you think back to being young yourself, things stick with you, don't they? You can remember key adults, whether it be a teacher, a parent, or whoever. They might say something about you, and even now as an adult you remember it. It kind of like sticks with you, and it can stay part of you. We just need to remember how powerful language can be. Oh, thanks, Nick. Okay, Nick, have I missed anything, do you think, on
no, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
shall I move on, Jo? Oh, sorry, does somebody want to say something?
Yeah, so yeah, maybe just to reiterate then, so it's about us being mindful of the language we use, as well as thinking about how to scaffold the language skills of a child. We're kind of coming at that from kind of two different angles, really, and ensuring that we're aware of the language around the child. I guess I'm thinking about, I've done some work with a couple of my secondary schools around the language they use within their school systems, and I'm sure many of you who work with schools will be familiar with sort of language like conforming, you know, and consequences, and I've done a little bit of work with some of my schools in thinking about some of that language, and what one of the words that was being used was kind of the child had failed because they'd got a certain consequence, for example, and we've started trying to think about some of those words and think about some of that language and the impact that might then have on how the young person sees themselves. And just, you could still have the same system, but just by changing the language, it can shift the way that young people respond, because it's shifting the way that they actually think about themselves. It's, if you think about a school system that wants children to be conformist, that's not necessarily linking in with a child who has a very strong sense of independence and very much challenges accepted ways around them, or is maybe even a little bit politically minded and wants to challenge what's going on around them. So it's just thinking about how we word things to encourage growth in young people in a positive way, and bring that into their sense of who they are. Okay. So I think Nick's just shared my email address on the chat. Do you want to explain why, Nick, because you're moving on to the activity? Yep.
So we're going on to an activity now where we're going to put you in breakout rooms. We're going to have 15 minutes for this, but perhaps if we have just a bit less, Jo, so that we don't run over 12 o'clock. I'll just quickly explain what we're doing. When we put you in breakout rooms, we're going to put you into 6 breakout rooms, and you need to have a look at which number breakout room you're in once you're going into your breakout room, because the number of room that you're in will coincide with the number of the question on here that we'd like you to look at. I've put the questions in the breakout room as well, but I was hoping to share this table. I've tried to connect it, I've tried to upload it, but it won't upload. So the important thing is that you've got the questions. So in the chat, if you'd like to open the questions, I think before you leave the main room, because I'm not entirely sure whether you can still carry on seeing the main chat once you're in your breakout rooms. I think you can, but just in case you can't, it might be a good idea to download those questions now. And when you're in your room, you're going to discuss the question that links with the room number in relation to what you think about that. So each question links with one of the pillars that we've talked about, or the social environment aspect of identity that we talked about being the foundation for them all. And we'd like you to think about the question in relation to how you could implement that in your work context in any way, what meaning it could have for your work context, and how that particular pillar that you've got relates to the others in the way we've sort of tried to describe identity here. And if you'd also like to add any comments you have about the way we've tried to conceptualize the whole idea of identity with the pillars and the social environments at the bottom, whether you think that's useful or not, and why, that would be really helpful for us. As Joe said, we're trying to develop this really, so this workshop was a good opportunity for us to get your feedback, for you to help us move forward with it. Right, so
can I just be clear what you're asking people to do?
Yeah.
So you're asking them to, you've put the questions into the chat.
Yes, they're the same ones that are on this table. But
yeah, and you're asking them to open those now before they go into the breakout rooms, and then they're going to just choose the one question that goes with their breakout room. So if they're in breakout room 1, they're just answering question 1.
That's right. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just,
that makes sense.
I was just checking, because it, like you said, we couldn't get the table on there. And then how it relates to their work context. How it relates to your work context is the primary question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But if you've got any ideas of how it relates to other pillars, that'd be great.
Could you just clarify question 4, please?
Oh, let's have a look. Oh gosh, that's a typo, isn't it? How does your setting, I think it should say, support the child or young person? I don't quite know what's happened to that. It's got a bit mangled. How does your setting support the child or young person's cohesive identity development? And how can you continue to do this in the future? So I think just ignore that. So in the future, it's on the first line. Sorry about that.
Okay.
No, thank you for raising that.
We've not spotted that. Okay.
If you're not in a setting, then take it as your service. You know, if you're not a setting as such, you're a service, just take it as your service.
Yeah. And we've not done this very often on Zoom. We've not been the host very often, so we'll bring you back to the main room with a few minutes before 12 to go, and it might, if it seems a bit sudden, we apologize in advance. If you're suddenly transported as if you're in a Harry Potter film and you've just apparated out of one room and into another, then we do apologize. Okay. So I think you've got an invitation. I think you've probably got to click on the link, and just like we said, remember your breakout room number. So, Donna, are you struggling? I think we've got Donna, Teresa, are you struggling to join? I think Teresa's nipped off.
It's telling me to go to room 6. Shall I do that? Or do you want me to
Oh, there's only you and Charles assigned to room 6, Joe.
Is there? Oh,
Yeah.
better go then.
So he'll
I'll
be
go.
on his own if you don't go.
I'll go.
Catherine, are you struggling to join? Hi everybody, are you all back?
You weren't kidding about teleporting, were you?
It feels so strange, doesn't it? Especially when you're in the middle of a conversation. I think I managed to give you an extra minute by mistake.
Okay, we are running very short on time, Nick, aren't we?
Yeah.
I wonder if so are we were asking people to email me any comments, weren't we, if they've got any additional feedback, but can we
That's
just
right.
yeah, can we just take the remaining time to take feedback, either verbally or pop stuff in the chat? And we'd be
Oops.
really interested in your ideas from that. Or
Joe, I
any,
can't see the chat anymore at the moment, so I was just trying to find it, but I can't find it again. So
no, I can, yeah, I can see the
okay,
chat.
great.
So yeah, please feedback from the activity or any comments you've got about the work we're doing. We'd really appreciate it.
I think, sorry, did you say in the chat or
Either
just come back
yeah,
in? I had to miss the small group apparently and take a brief screen break, so apologies for that. But for me, I think the pillars are great because I still, whilst you can explain that they interact, and I think we all get that, they just really symbolise strength. And so I like the pillars analogy for that reason.
That's interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. Do we have any feedback on the oh, yep. Oh yeah, could you post the email again, Nick, please? It's been requested in the chat.
Yes, I will. I'm just going to end the slideshow for a second while I do that because I can't see anything at the moment.
We can't see the slideshow, Nick.
Oh, can't you?
You
Okay.
can stop sharing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So many things to learn about Zoom.
But thank you. Yeah, we did question 3, sense of belonging, pupil voice. Oh, thanks, Joe. So Joe's saying that they did question 3, pupil voice, observation of interaction with peers, professionals, carers, etc. Views of carers, brilliant. Pupils work, yep. Thinking about anxiety. So yeah, thanks ever so much for that, Joe. Thinking around sense of belonging. Attendance, participation. Yeah, attendance actually. That's and participation. Kind of attendance is the basics, isn't it? Actually, actually being there and supporting participation. Thanks for that, Joe. Really helpful.
I suppose the whole idea of identity and that especially the sense of belongingness is a real key factor, isn't it, about attending, about whether young people attend school in the first place. Absolutely.
I'm conscious it's 12 o'clock and I think you need to go somewhere else, if I remember rightly from the programme. Please, you've got my email address in there. Please, if you've got any other comments, we would really appreciate them, or any other feedback from the questions. Sorry, it's kind of been a little bit rushed at the end. It just wasn't long enough. But it's really nice to meet everyone. Thanks ever so much. And
Thank you both. It's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks. Hope you enjoy the rest of the session.
Yeah, lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Joe, I'm just thinking about how to save what's in the chat. I know there's a way of doing it. I don't know if you can remember or tell me quickly, Rachel. I've seen it before, but now I can't
3
find
dots. So next to where you type in a message, there should be a little symbol that says file.
Oh yeah.
And 3 dots next to it say save chat.
Ah, brilliant. Thank you. I knew I'd seen it somewhere.
I would save it, but I dropped out, so it won't save everything. I'll only be able to see the last few messages.
Okay, thank you. That's the other thing. Is that always the case that when they go and come back to the main room that they lose you lose all the chat?
Seems to be, yeah. It's almost as if you've left the meeting.
Yeah, that's a shame, isn't it?
Shame. Yeah, because I can now, well, I actually left the meeting to join another workshop, but I can now only see the last few messages.
Well, even I can, and we you know, even as the presenter, you still can only see. You wouldn't have thought the whole room chat would shut down like that, would you? That's a bit strange.
Yeah, I think we all need to come out. So
Okay,
yeah,
so we've got to close it, I think, Nick.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Oh,
yeah.
Right. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks, Rachel.